Iranian Studies book launch featuring Majnun and Layla. We are grateful to Aqsa Ijaz, Thomas Harrison, and Yann Damizen for accepting our invitation and joining us today. I'm also grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for their exemplary support of the institute. Additionally, I wish to thank the Department of Language Studies, University of Toronto, Mississauga, and the Consulate General of France in Toronto for their generous co-sponsorship of today's event. At the outset, and before introducing our speakers, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach under ancestral homeland. Our first speaker is Dr. Aqsa Ijaz, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Language Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and teaches Persian and Urdu language courses. Aqsa specializes in classical Persian poetry and studies its reception in medieval and early modern North India. As a scholar of Persian, Urdu, and Punjabi, Aqsa's research focuses on the reception of the 12th century Persian poet Nizami Ganjavi and examines the formative role of Nizami's poetry in shaping the vernacular cultures in pre-modern North India. Besides her scholarly work, Aqsa is an essayist and a translator and writes for various international publications, such as the World Literature Today, the Herald, and the Los Angeles Review of Book. Aqsa is committed to sharing her academic research with audiences across the globe, and for which she serves on the editorial board of the Marginalia Review of Book. Aqsa Ijaz, please.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Can everyone hear me? And see my screen as well? Well, I would really like to begin by thanking Professor Mohammed Tawakkuli for allowing us this opportunity to launch this wonderful book at the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. Those of us who work here know very well that without Professor Tawakkuli's loving support, none of our projects would see the light of the day. So, really, Mohammed Jan Bakhian, as Sami Metal Websapas. I would also like to thank my colleagues here, Shabnam Gulpandan and Bilal, for making this event possible. Last but not the least, I would also like to thank my home department here, the Department of Language Studies, for coming on board and making this event possible. Today, we are gathered here to launch this amazing book, written and illustrated by Yann Damizen, entitled Majnun and Layla, Songs from Beyond the Grave. It's a new retelling of Nizami Ganjavi's famous love poem, Leyli of Majnun, and presents the classical Persian poem in a completely new perspective of the 21st century. The book is originally written in French, which I and my esteemed colleague at UCLA, Professor Thomas Harrison, have translated into English for the Humanoid Publishers and an imprint of Simon & Schuster. For that, I would like to extend a special thanks to Amanda Lucido for making this wonderful collaboration possible and allowing us to bring this wonderful piece of poetic and visual art to the English-speaking world. Many of you who are in attendance today are no strangers to the names Majnun and Layla, or the legend of their tragic love that has continued to resonate for centuries. Be it India, Afghanistan, Central Asia, or Iran, the story of Majnun and Layla has become an archetypical reference penetrating a vast number of literary and linguistic communities throughout the Eastern Islamic world. Whether it is Urdu poetry, cinema in the Indian subcontinent, or the Azari opera in Central Asia, the story of Layla and Majnun has inspired some of the most eloquent articulations of human longing and spiritual deepening. It is interesting to note that even though the story originates in pre-modern Arabia, its resonance does not end with its popularity within the Arabic world. Those of you who are less familiar with the intricately connected literary cultures of the Eastern Islamic world would know the story of these star-crossed lovers through its various iterations in the Western popular culture. For example, to name the most widely known one, think of Eric Clapton's famous song Layla, that the musician wrote and sang when he found himself on the brink of madness in the event of desperately falling in love with his best friend George Harrison's wife. Emulating our Majnun in the throes of desire for an unattainable beloved, Clapton not only found solace through this song, but also achieved worldwide fame like his Eastern Literary predecessor. But one thing that separated Clapton from Majnun is that Clapton was ultimately lucky enough to be united with the love of his life, whereas our Majnun, as we know it, has remained condemned to sing the song of separation for eternity. The story of Layla and Majnun goes way back in time. According to A.A. Sayyid Ghahrab, one of the most eminent scholars in the field of Persian studies, the story originates in 11th century Arabia and is connected to a semi-historical character named Qais of Banu Amir tribe, who reportedly fell in love with his cousin and faced the tragic eventuality of unrequited love. Professor Ghahrab refers to a book named Kitab al-Aghani, Book of Songs, attributed to the 10th century writer Abul Faraj al-Asfahani, to suggest that Qais was a historical individual and lived sometime during the Umayyad period. According to Isfahani, Qais used the pseudonym Majnun, literally meaning possessed, and was known to express his unrequited love for his cousin by singing love songs about the pangs of separation and encountering misfortune in public. The genre of the story of Layla and Majnun belongs to the Udri tradition of nomadic love poetry that emerged on the Arabian Peninsula during the Umayyad period between 7th and 8th centuries. The tradition is named after the Banu Udara tribe, which was renowned for its poets and their unique style of writing love poetry. Udri romance narratives are written rather simply, in a sense that the plot is mostly uneventful and revolve around the theme of unrequited love and intensities of emotions such as grief, longing, and madness. The characters in a typical Udri romance are semi-historical, and their actions are similar to and easily interchangeable with those characters from other Udri romances. Usually, the plot of an Udri story would read something like this. The lover falls in love at a tender age with his cousin or a woman or a young woman he has known at his childhood. But the girl's father refuses to allow their union and marries her off to another man. The lovers are forbidden to see each other, which causes violent and perennial suffering for them. They remain chaste all their life, expressing their emotions in poetry. They are made distraught by love. The male lover roams the desert alone, composing love poems about his beloved. As Professor Ghahrab notes, physical contact is alien to these stories, and when the lovers have an opportunity to meet, they sing poetry for each other while weeping. To put in the words of Mia Gerhard, they exemplify the heroism of sentiment and not of action. The language of Udri stories is direct and devotional, describing the lover's agony, suffering, but above all, his supplication to God to increase his love. Despite the pangs of separation, the lover remains constant, bemoaning his unattainable union and ill fate in a poignant poetic voice. As you can see in the general outline of the Udri plot, Udri romances have largely been read as portrayals of pure platonic and often unrequited love, depicting an idealized and chaste representation of human body. They are widely believed among scholars as being interested primarily in the emotional and spiritual aspects rather than physical or sensual aspects of human desire. In the recent scholarship on the Udri tradition, however, the question of the representation of the body of these stories' purported emphasis on chastity has been contested with a new intellectual rigor. Here I am specifically thinking of Joka Al-Harthi's recent book entitled The Body in Arabic Love Poetry, the Udri Tradition, in which through brilliant close readings of various Udri texts written between the 8th and 11th centuries, she contends that traditional much wanted emphasis on chastity and the assumption that Udri poetry omits any concept of the body is only a stereotypical idea that is grounded in much too familiar cliches about the purity of love, echoing the medieval European notion of unconsummated courtly love. Turning the tables on this rather monolithic reading of the classical Arabic tradition, Al-Harthi effectively rebuts the problem of mind-body dualism in Arabic love poetry and opens a new dimension in the study of pre-modern societies that in a very refreshing way deconstructs, or rather I should say overcomes this backward projected Cartesian dualism in the study of pre-modern literatures. Those of you who are interested in exploring the question of the body in classical Arabic tradition, I highly recommend that you read this book. The tradition of this nomadic love poetry that started on the Arabian Peninsula during the 7th century came to the Persian world sometime in the 11th century. As far as scholars have been able to trace the origins of this story in Persian culture, the first Persian versification of an Udri plot takes us back to Ayuki's Varka and Gulsha, a poem that very much inspired the ultimate retelling of the story by Nizami Ganjavi in his famous Leyli or Majnun. Composed in 1188 CE, approximately in 4,600 lines in the Hazaj meter, Nizami's Leyli or Majnun was the third Masnavi in his Khamsar, the quintet, recounting the famous Udri love story with various innovations, appropriating it to the tastes of medieval Persian poetry readership. Nizami's rendering, despite the challenges of his culturally alien plot and the poet's own unwillingness to entertain the composition of the poem, is the most well-known point of reference in the retelling tradition of Layla and Majnun narrative. These are some of the verses from Nizami's opening, where he says that there is no garden, no imperial banquet, no song, no wine, and nothing fortunate. On the sands, dryness, and mountains, hardness, with a few utterances said in anguish. So this is how he described the legend of Layla and Majnun. He thought it's not very appropriate to the taste of medieval Persian courtly society. In line with conventional plot line of Udri narratives, Nizami's Leyli or Majnun remains simple and reads on the following plot line. Faiz falls in love with Leyli at school, but Leyli's father forbids any contact. Separated from Leyli, Majnun becomes obsessed with her, singing of his love for her in public. The obsession grows to the point that he sees and evaluates everything in terms of Leyli. When he realizes that he cannot obtain union even when other people intercede for him, he grows disillusioned with society and roams naked in the desert among the beasts. Contemplating the image of Leyli increases his love so that he cannot eat or sleep. His only activity is thinking of Leyli and composing love songs for her. Meanwhile, Leyli is betrothed against her will, but she guards her virginity by resisting her husband's advances. She arranges secret meetings with Majnun, and when they meet, they have no physical contact. Rather, they recite poetry to each other from a distance. When Leyli's husband dies, removing the legal obstacle to illicit union, Majnun is so focused on the idealized picture of Leyli that he runs away to the desert. Leyli dies out of grief and is buried in her bridal dress. Hearing this news, Majnun runs to the grave where he instantly dies. They are buried side by side and their graves become a site of pilgrimage. In the Coda, Majnun's friend Zaid dreams that they are united in the heavens, living the blissful eternity sanctioned by God. As we can see in this summary of this plotline, Nizami's poem is written very much in the genre of Udri romance, and the general outline of its events aligns well with the characteristics I mentioned earlier. You have here unrequited love, madness resulting from it, singing and poetry highlighting its symptoms, and lovers dying without ever having any bodily contact with each other. Those of you who have read Nizami's version know well that Nizami mentions his sources at the beginning of every chapter in Leyli or Majnun, around 17 times in total to be exact, and refers to various Arabic anecdotes, situating the story in the conventional context of an Udri romance. However, while scholars have written extensively on Nizami's sources, I wouldn't spend too much energy here on ascertaining his sources, because even though Nizami has very elaborate description of factual situatedness of his stories, such as the use of the asnad in Leyli or Majnun, or the references to realist geography in his Khosrow Shirin, scholars have not been able to ascertain whether his sources are verifiable or not. The boundary between history and fiction remains mostly porous in his poems, and therefore I think it's better to refrain from the impossible debate at this point and focus instead on the aesthetic perception of his poem that brings us today to Damizen's retelling. As you can see in this beautiful image and the remarkable text accompanying it in Yann's retelling, following Nizami's poem, several poets have written retellings of Leyli and Majnun. You have here the 13th century Indo-Persian poet Amir Khusro of Delhi, followed by the Afghan poet Abdul Rahman Jami, poets who are considered two literary heirs of Nizami's poem in medieval India and early modern Afghanistan. Of course, these are not the only poets who have engaged Nizami's rendering of the Arabic legend. There have been numerous vernacular poets after Jami who have retold Nizami's poem in Urdu, Braj, Dakkani, and Punjabi languages. And ongoing scholarship, including my own work, is effectively tapping that arena of the Persian poet's reception. But this slide, the opening of Damizen's retelling, is of particular interest to me, as I'm sure it is for people who are in this room today. As you see here, Damizen doesn't give up on the signature conventions of pre-modern Persian poetry, as even some English translators of the poems do. In fact, he uses them to expand the literary experience of his book as a retelling, whose primary pleasure lies in the very oscillation that makes the reader think about the prior text while reading the current one. In the spirit of canon indexing, a poetic convention through which the contemporary poet chooses his literary predecessors, literally indexing them as figures amongst whom he wants to be counted, Damizen very cleverly situates himself in the tradition while maintaining his own artistic individuality. He does so advertently or inadvertently, quite similarly to other pre-modern poets who, from Amir Khusro onward, have established this convention to its foremost expression as we know it. To give you a couple of examples from other Persian retellings of Nizami's poems, here are some verses from Amir Khusro's prologue to his retelling of Nizami's Khusro Shirin. Now, as you can see how he begins, it's Amir Khusro giving his apologia of writing the Jawab or the retelling of Nizami's second Masnavi, Khusro Shirin. And he says, Man az khudra kunam zin sikke nami, be Khusro ke resad milke Nizami. جو اول تیز بود الماس گفتم گوهر بگذاشتم خر مهر سفتم کنون که از مهره کردم لال را فرق ز سفتن باز ماند این تب شد برق. I make myself a great name from this currency, the property of Nizami that has reached Khusro. Since the first one, that is Nizami's work, was a well-faceted diamond, I let go of that precious gem and pierced glass beads instead. Now when from my glass beads I separated his gems, the character of my seal was set apart by way of piercing like a dazzling light. You can also take a look at this other interesting prologue that comes from medieval India by a historian named Isami, who writes the Indian version of the Shahnameh titled Futuhat-e-Salatin and uses the same form of canon indexing to assert his company he wants to be known in reference to. And he says, two poets in the art of Masnavi have achieved perfection in the world. One, Ferdowsi, made a peacock manifest itself and adorned Tools like paradise. The second, Nizami, made a nightingale sing and graced the garden of Ganja. I followed both of them and became the disciple of both in the art of Masnavi. From the peacock and nightingale in India, a melodious parrot, Khusro, was born. Now, if we come back to Damizen's proximity to this pre-modern convention of choosing one's literary predecessors in a way that reflects his own innovation on the ground of tradition, we see how he makes himself at home in the grand lineage of Nizami's retellers. We see that the highly metaphoric associations of Amir Khusro and Isami are replaced by an equally dynamic recentering of the language of art and painting that very much represents Damizen's poetic and artistic persona and makes him stand out as a new voice in this old chorus. Damizen writes, many bygone poets have braided lines of ink to encase in them ruby and diamond words. They have cast this jeweler's lake like an anchor to moor our hearts to the lover's isle. From the depths of the inkwell they have drawn perfumed tears, black and shadowy, to forge verses, evincing the pain and the joys of the pangs of love. Thus did three writers, wizards of the writing desk, Nizami, Khusro of Delhi, and Jami, tell us the sad and woeful story of unfortunate lovers, Majnun and Layla. As you can see in these beautiful verses, Damizen begins with the bejeweled imagery, reminiscent of Amir Khusro's Kenan index we saw earlier. He then moves to a more mixed imagery, bringing the jeweler, which in the pre-modern Persian tradition is a metaphor for the poet himself, to the natural world with the images of anchoring, the lake to moor our hearts to the lover's isle. But the most exciting part of Damizen's prologue comes in the next lines, where he tells us that these poets of yesteryears have drawn from their inkwell perfumed tears, black and shadowy, to forge verses. In the same spirit as Amir Khusro and Nizami, he names three writers, wizards of the writing desk, Nizami, Khusro of Delhi, and Jami, and activates in the reader's mind the same pleasure that allows one to oscillate between multiple temporalities at once, bridging the past and the present in a delicate interplay of memory and new experience. However, it is interesting to note that unlike Amir Khusro and Nizami, Damizen does not mention himself in words. That is, he does not write that particular verse where the equivalent of how I, the poetic persona of a contemporary poet, would change the course of action in this retelling. Instead, he transforms the entire tradition in the image, where all these poets, the wizards of the writing desks, are represented in his own image as painters and visual artists. So you can see, one of them might be Nizami, the other one might be Khusro, and then Jami, but they're all painting their poems, right? From here on, Damizen's retelling presents a mind-boggling visual delight as much as a profound verbal one. As you can see in these striking images describing Layla's beauty, the book is a highly imaginative journey into the world, into the story we have read, heard, and enjoyed several times since its inception in the 7th century. These images do more than depict. They make us feel the intricate paradox of desire, where one can be both jailer and captive within the same emotional confines. I would especially draw your attention to this side here, where she is the jailer and the jailed simultaneously. See? As a retelling of Nizami's poem, Damizen's book engages deeply with the themes of human longing and the multifaceted experiences of desire. His approach is not one of emulation, a common critique leveraged at adaptations of classical works, but rather a creative dialogue with Nizami's narrative, extending the story's thread beyond its 12th century conclusion. Retellings, as I have argued elsewhere, arise from a very peculiar narrative necessity, an open chasm in the plot, an unresolved element within the source text that beckons closure. They serve to pinpoint and bridge these lacunae. The enduring appeal of such poems lies in what they leave unspoken, prompting retellings from perspectives keen to address and perhaps heal these narrative rifts. They call our attention to what could be imagined now that was not imaginable in the previous eras of the poem's reception. And this occurs only when a text is interpreted against a vastly different hermeneutical backdrop than its own origin. Damizen's retelling, even though it begins closer to the opening of Nizami's poems, sticking closer to the Udri genre, is very special in the way it intervened the classical tradition from his distinctly modern horizon of reception. The actual story for Damizen begins not when the lovers fall in love with each other, but when Majnun dies and sings from beyond the grave and asks Layla to join him beyond the threshold. This is Majnun in the grave, and as you can see, it's the slow decay, and the songs actually begin from here. Their ensuing ethereal duet breaks the mold of traditional love poetry and challenges the trope of the woman as a mere follower of her lover's path. It portrays a profound reversal, showcasing the distinct fates of those who articulate their agony and those who embrace silence in their suffering. In this regard, Damizen's narrative inception coincides with Nizami's conclusion. Yet in tracing the path, he orchestrates a departure from the familiar tumult of Majnun's lamentation and attunes us instead to the language of silence, which we are invited to cultivate in order to understand the mysteries that lie beyond words and to grasp the unsayable, the concealed, encased metaphoric truths that lie at the heart of Damizen's narrative. I congratulate Yann for achieving such a remarkable feat of visual and poetic virtuosity and giving us a book whose pleasure is indeed in its ability to transport us into the vastness of time as well as into the depths of the most powerful moments of being human. Thank you very much. Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Let me just introduce you and then I'll hand over the reins to you.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Professor Thomas Harrison teaches literature, film, and music in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at University of California at Los Angeles. With a PhD in comparative literature, he works regularly in Italian, French, English, and German. His courses at UCLA range from lower division offerings in the spaghetti western and other topics in Italian cinema to graduate courses in aesthetics and translation. Indeed, Harrison is himself a translator, as in the case of the book we have before us, mainly of poetry and philosophy from both Italian and French. A volume called The Favorite Malice, Ontology and Reference in Contemporary Italian Poetry includes lyrics and critical essays by prominent Italian poets today, while another collected volume called Nietzsche in Italy features translation of Giorgio Agamben, Vattimo, Jean-Luc Musy, and Michel Serres, among others. Above all, a specialist in modern European intellectual history and the comparative arts, Harrison has most recently authored my favorite book, Of Bridges, a Poetic and Philosophical Account, with the University of Chicago Press. He has also penned 1910, The Emancipation of Dissonance, which is a study of cross-disciplinary European expressionism, and another book-length study called Essays on Conrad Musil and Pirandello. Welcome to our institute, Tom.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you from this distance of mine. Thanks for having me. Well, let me begin by saying that it was really a pleasure to translate this book. And I thank you all for that, including the publisher who was directed by one of my ex-students from UCLA. So she contacted me for this translation and I said, hey, I can do it for you. In fact, I know the perfect person who can collaborate on this, and that's Aqsa Ijaz, and the rest of it, as they say, is history. So it was fun, but it was also a challenge. And I would say that the challenge of this translation lay in the stateliness of the language that Yann Damizen uses. That is to say, he uses the Alexandrine meter, which, as you know, is the most, the high meter of French literature. Goes back to, well, it goes back very far, but it's famous for the dramas of Corneille and Racine and so on. Very, very noble meter. And yet this Alexandrine is hard to notice because the visuals are so impressive that one fails to pay attention to the verse. You see, the visuals garner the most attention when you're reading this book. One even fails to notice the development of the plot because of the visuals. And so it took me a while to figure out what was going on there on the purely literary level. Now, this is, of course, a consequence of the graphic novel. You know, that is, when you write a novel that is mainly pictures, then you're not noticing the conceptual part as much as you would otherwise. And it was this graphic dimension of the work that sent Aqsa and I to the illustrated manuscript tradition in our afterword. That is, when we commented on the tale, and you saw some of that in Aqsa's presentation, we thought it was interesting how this graphic novel is a development of sorts of the illustrated manuscript of the Middle Ages. Of course, the difference is that in the illustrated manuscript, you only have one illumination every, after hundreds of verses, typically at the beginning of a chapter. Whereas here, you've got it for every line. So in a sense, the graphic novel is closer to cinema if you like, even than it is to the illustrated manuscript. Because in the movies, you've got the image and you've got the words being given simultaneously. But then again, in the movies, the sound and the words are being offered by the images naturally, spontaneously. So you don't have to read when you're watching a movie. But here you have to read as you see the visual. So in a sense, you have a more double text with the graphic novel than you have even in filmmaking. So that's a dimension actually of the graphic novel that requires more attention than we can give it here today. But I do think that there's a big space for it in academic study. And it's for this reason that in our afterword, Aqsa and I decided to comment on that second tradition to which Yann Damizen belongs, in addition to the first. The first, of course, is the retelling of the tale of Nizami that Aqsa has commented on. So he fits into that tradition, but he also must be looked at, I feel, in the tradition of the illumination of the study, the visualization of the concept. Another dimension of this project that I haven't reflected enough upon and I can't go into, but I want to bring up today is that we're dealing with a tale in Persian that went into French. The text that we looked at is in French, and then we put that into English. And so what you get by the time it's published in the United States is a transposition of 3 languages, right? Now, back then to the question of the translation's challenges, and that brings us back to the Alexandrine. 12-syllable, every line, and for the most part, our author illustrator sticks to it. And that made it imperative for us to find something that was its equivalent. And the only thing that is its equivalent is, of course, the iambic pentameter. So that's sometime very soon, as I was translating the first draft, I figured that out, and I said we have to go to we have to use iambic pentameter here. And the iambic pentameter, you know, is the verse form of even of Shakespeare, although it's not always rhymed, and nor is the Alexandrine rhymed in this Majnun text. So there wasn't that need to do it. But I tried to follow in my draft the rhythm of the iambic pentameter, which, as you know, is tatum, 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 5 feet, 5 accents, done in that form. But it doesn't have to be mechanical and should not be mechanical. Otherwise, it becomes awfully dull. And not even the great English poets are mechanically using one iamb after another. You're perfectly free and invited to substitute an iamb with something else, like a trochee, where you accent the first syllable instead of the second, or a spondee, where you have 2 accented. Well, after a while, once I figured out that the objective was to make this language poetic, I started to play with things, and I started substituting iambs with other types of meter, which could involve not only the trochee and the spondee, but also the anapest, da 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 da, or the dactyl, da 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 da. So I thought I would give you some examples of that. So you should have now my slideshow. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, so here's just 3 lines, you know, three verses as they come across in English. A neighboring youth, a dazzling sun, seeming like an angel sprung forth from light, held her prisoner in a cage of love. So what you have really is you've got an iamb, a neighboring youth, a dazzling sun, an iamb followed by an anapest, a neighboring youth, followed by an iamb, and followed again by another anapest. So you end up, I've ended up here with not 4 feet, but 10 syllables nonetheless. The next line, seeming like an angel sprung forth from light, trochee, trochee, trochee. 3 trochees followed by a spondee, sprung forth, and ending with an I am. Held her prisoner in a cage of love. This is a verse where you actually have the whole verse is a mirror image. You divide it exactly in half. The first half is exactly like the second half reversed, because the first foot is a trochee, held her prisoner, dactyl. So trochee, dactyl, anapest, I am. So the rhythm of the second half of the verse mirrors and inverts the first half. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff that we ended up doing, which is we tried to preserve the iambic pentameter wherever possible, and 10 to 12 syllables, sometimes 8, when the English didn't provide, because you have to make the compromise between something that is colloquial but not too stilted. So that was the procedure. Now, with your permission, I think that Aqsa did a good job of getting across the flavor of this book, but I had sort of thought of doing something similar. So if you have the slideshow up there, do you still have it there?
Yes, you can see it.
Okay. So I thought I would give you some sense of how the visuals here are working too. I must say that from the plot point of view, there are about 4 or 5 different chapters or acts in this story. And one of the most interesting acts is the one I'd like to read to you now. It's not formally separated in a chapter because Yann has 3 chapters, but nonetheless, once Majnun is rejected by the family of Layla, he goes to the desert. And here he enters into a very long-standing tradition, which is not only going to the desert to find yourself, but also dying in order to be reborn. And in the process of dying and reborn, it's poetry that becomes the hero. So I would like to show you how the words are working with the images here. If you can read there, I'll read them for you. And we'll comment on it for just a little bit. So Majnun sought solitude and refuge. Taking to the desert, he walked onward. Seeking some shelter, a secret cave, where the only witness would be the ear of the wind, where nothing but stones and echoes and moonlight could hear him cry, where nothing could hear him howl but the beasts, the jinns, and the sand of the dune. You see, he gets smaller and smaller. By the third image, he's very small, and the sun has become very big in the fourth. I'm having trouble reading my top verse because of the screen share. Let me do it from the book. His feet twisted, burned, bruised, and bloodied. His shadow before him, his reason far behind. Shaggy, bedraggled, lice-ridden, and toothless, and always mumbling like a man in prayer, he walked on for a long while without ever stopping, not eating, nor drinking, nor even sleeping. Notice how he goes from clothed in the top left to he gets increasingly yellow, orange, and finally red as his hair also grows. But overcome by fatigue, he ended up stumbling on a rock and falling. He complied with his fate. So it is that I stop at this place. Here will I die, under the eyes of the stars. Here will I chant until my very last breath. Then jackals and vultures will come to suck my marrow. And here, the 2 images are him falling first, and then he's at the bottom here, at the very bottom of the frame with the fear of death. Lying on the earth, he closed his eyes. As soon as he fell asleep, he began to dream. So the red Majnun up there is contrasted with the Majnun in the dream underneath. With a mattress of only sand and stones, he went to drink in the Garden of Dreams. His dream then is of him and Layla surrounded by the friendly animals. And despite his sleep, his mouth quivered, his lips shivered, not from cold, but from love. Asleep, he whined, recited, moaned the verses, cadenced by the drum of his pulse. The name of Layla fled through the night, spreading its wings and intermingling like drops of water from a leaky bowl, pouring a regular couplet into the silence. So what's getting interesting to me here is that although Majnun is completely asleep, the poetry has taken over him, and he's not even in control of it anymore, and it fills the universe that surrounds him. The sun rose and then set again, and you can see it rise in the middle panel all the way to the top, and then it set again by the fifth panel. Majnun moved no more, yet his parched tongue kept chatting the creed of the devotee, to whom each sigh was a secret prayer. He should have died long ago, frozen by night or burnt by day. For alone in the desert one can only perish, yet one must believe one can live on love. His breath was stubborn and his body held out, his life hung on a spider's thread. Yet nevertheless that tenuous link persisted, and the hand of Azrael stayed away. So I haven't given you the slide. You see that the chord is at its weakest at the top, and then because of his breath and indirectly the poetry, the chord strengthens. Believing nonetheless that they sensed an imminent death, the beasts of the desert slowly converged. So in the top image, you have only 5 of them. In the middle one, you've got maybe 10 or 12. And then at the bottom, you have many. And in the next page, these beasts that converge around the Fool of Love, their fiery eyes eagerly focused on his fragile throat and his graceful neck, iron teeth and claws, bare lips, ready to pounce, to break the vigil, to celebrate the scarlet wedding and the orgy, to feast on flesh, to frolic in blood, to have a full belly and a reddened mouth, to perforate, lacerate, bite, and pierce. Now the animals with their aggression have completely hemmed in Majnun, who's of course unconscious. You can see tigers, you can see lions and fish and dragons. So they want to devour him. But there was going to be a turnaround. But time kept passing. They did not move. A miracle or spell had petrified them. Majnun, who was on the verge of death, held them in chains, stunned by his song. His loving murmur had entranced them. Bathing their eyes with tears and filing their canines, they were like comforted souls, hearing the rising voice of the muezzins in the morning. So he has taken on a religious power to tame the wild beasts. The dawn found them subjugated, this strange brotherhood of reptiles, birds, and wild beasts, their look vague, imbued with street reverie, hypnotized, intoxicated, drunk as if drugged. Each one of these images represents the eye, and the eye in all cases is crying. So the beasts have become humanized, if you will, through the figure of the poet. As the rays of the sun became hotter, the voice of love's fool began to fade. Death was there more than ever, rushing against him, finally opening its arms, preparing to embrace him. And look how nice this bottom image is, because Majnun is very small there at the bottom in red, and death has these big red arms that are trying to embrace him and take him in as death's own. But the birds of prey, they spread their wings, extending their protective shadow over Majnun. Here you have death again at the top. Now the arms you can see the hands of, but in a buffer zone between death and Majnun are the animals that he has charmed. And in the bottom image, the camel and the lioness offered their udders, the snake and lizards their benevolent coolness. Thanks to this treatment, together they saved him. The madman opened his eyes and resumed his litany. So it's the animals who bring him back to life because he has charmed them. So you've got this perfectly wonderful circularity between the world of nature and the world of poetry. And I'll end with another image or two. the bottom of this page, it says, when evening came, the beasts lay down, blocking the cold, repelling the agony. See how they protect Majnun, who is very small in the middle? From the seven climes of the world, other beasts, attracted by the voice of this brother of Orpheus, immerse themselves in the deep trance of those within his magic circle. Thus Majnun became king of a strange court, surrounded by animals hanging on his lips. Majnun is at the very bottom of the image, and now you have this train of animals, all the animals coming from the seven climes of the world. This reminds me of a famous painting by Gentile da Fabriano, The Adoration of the Magi in Florence, where there's this kind of serpentine road of all the people going, in that case, of course, to pay respects to the infant Jesus. But here you've got the same idea, you really do, in a different tradition. And the hero of this, of course, instead is the poet. So I would just stop there to give the word to our author and artist, and also, of course, to any questions or discussions that may arise as needed. Thank you. So I give the word back to the room. I don't hear any microphone from there. If
Can you hear me now, Tom?
yes, now, yes, thanks.
Okay, great. I'm just introducing Yann. Yann Damizen is a French illustrator and cartoonist born in 1991. He studied illustration and drawing for 4 years. Afterward, he illustrated a few children's books before turning to comics. His first comic book, a biography of the Austrian pianist Walt Wittgenstein, was published in France in 2019. Majnun and Layla is his second book as an author and cartoonist. He also published a few short stories in some magazines and fanzines, and he currently teaches comics at the Emily Cole Art School in Lyon, France. Welcome to our institute, Yann.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay. So before anything, I would like to express my profound gratitude to Aqsa and Thomas for all the work they have done on the translation of the book. And I would also like to thank Amanda Lucido and everyone involved in the publication of the translation. Also all the people involved in the organization of this event, and also all the people attending it. So thank you very much to you all. As you can probably hear, I'm not very used to speaking English, so I hope that you'll be able to understand me without too much trouble, and that you won't mind my huge French accent. So sorry about that. I try to do my best to speak proper English. So when I spoke with Aqsa about what I could tell you tonight, she said to me that it would be interesting if I spoke about how I came to know the story of Leyli and Majnun, and why I decided to make a comic book out of it, and what led me to bring some personal changes on the canvas of the story. So I will try to do that. Considering my discovery of the story of Leyli and Majnun, I can't remember exactly when or where I read or heard of the story for the first time. I guess that it had probably been in my childhood, because I have a feeling that I have probably always known that Majnun and Leyli or Layla were the names of two star-crossed Arabic lovers, but I didn't really know more than that. But as a child, I used to read a lot, and I had many books compiling tales and stories from all around the world and coming from different cultures. And I think that my first encounter with Leyli and Majnun probably occurred in one of those books, even if I can't be sure and I can't remember precisely. But I can remember that at the time, I especially liked stories coming from, let's say, the Middle East or Islamic cultures. I especially liked the one on the 1001 Nights, on that kind of stories. And I had developed some, I would say, weird Orientalist fascination for Islamic cultures. And I was always drawing mosques, even though I had never seen a mosque and I had never walked into one. So I had this interest, but it faded a little bit away when I grew up and when I became a teenager. And I would say that the real encounter with Majnun and Layla was was way later in my life, probably during my 20s, when I started to read by pure chance French translations of Persian poetry. And I immediately loved it. And I fell in love with this poetry. At the same time, it was really strange to me because I missed all the references. I had not read the Quran at the time, but at the same time, it felt very familiar to me. And I don't know, the imagery that was developed in the poems had really an echo to me. So I was really eager to learn more about that culture because I didn't really know many things because my childish interest had been very superficial, of course. So I read many books about Sufism, about Persian culture, and that kind of topics. And doing so, I really fell in love deeper and deeper with Persian literature and with the story of Majnun and Layli. I also decided to learn Persian, even though I'm not a very talented speaker. And I met people coming from Iran and Afghanistan. I met some friends. And after a few years, I traveled to Iran for the first time. And that was at that time that I became aware of the work of Nizami. And he soon became one of my favorite poets throughout French or English translations, because unfortunately my Persian was not and is still not good enough to allow me to read it with ease and fluidity, I would say. And as I was very passionate and enthusiastic about Nizami, I spoke to my friends about him and about the stories he wrote. And most of the time, my friends had never heard of him. So the names of Rumi or Khayyam were sometimes familiar to them, but not Nizami at all. So I started to think that I could make a comic book out of one of his masterpieces, and that it would be a way to make it accessible to a wider French audience. But for a very long time, I didn't start this project really because I thought on the one hand that I had no real legitimacy to do that because I was French, I was not of Persian descent, I was not speaking a very good Persian. And the second reason was that I thought that I lacked a lot of knowledge and that I had to read more and to learn more without engaging in this kind of project. But I still had this idea and it stuck to my mind. And that was an Iranian friend of mine who convinced me to start working on it. He told me that since the story of Leyli and Majnun had already been told so many times, and that it had traveled a lot, a French comic book version would not break this tradition of retelling the story again and again. And he said to me that in a way, it would even be a perfect continuation of it. So that's how it started. Very early in the process of writing the scenario, I had the idea that since poetry is so intertwined with the story of Leyli and Majnun, my comic book had to be a poem. So that's why I chose to write in verses, in French verses, using the French Alexandrine, which is, let's say, the most classical and majestic French verse. To prepare my book, I read pretty much all I could find in French about Majnun and Layli, and especially the French translations of the Arabic poems, which are attributed to Majnun. And in some of these poems, the lover says that he would keep on declaiming his love for his loved one, even when his corpse would be rotting, even after death. So that gave me the idea that in my version of the story, Majnun would speak beyond the grave, using the voices of the animals that would devour his body. But to do this, Majnun had to die before Leyli, which was the first difference to Nizami's story. But it was a common point with Jami's version in which Majnun dies first. So I wrote the first version of my book, a first draft, and it started at the death of Majnun. Majnun's body was eaten by animals. The animals were possessed by Majnun and his love, and they gathered around Leyli, and they urged her to join Majnun in death, and she happily kind of accepted, and she was also eaten by the animals. That was like the first version. But the people who read this first draft of the scenario, they told me that they felt they lacked the background of the story. So that's why I added a chapter at the beginning, which tells how Leyli and Majnun fall in love with each other and why their love is impossible. And finally, this first chapter came to represent half the book. I also added a short preamble paying a tribute to the poets who told the story, naming Nizami, Ganjavi, and Khosrow de la Vie. And this preamble to me was both a wink to the preambles and panegyrics that open classical Persian narrative poems. And it was also, of course, a way for me to acknowledge all that I owe to the poets that who wrote this story before. So I thought when I did that I was done with the scenario, but in fact I wasn't, because I grew more and more uncomfortable with the ending I had imagined, where Leyli joined Majnun in death. Of course, this end was faithful to the tradition, and it has definitely beauty in it, and it has a deep spiritual meaning, but at the same time, such an ending bothered me for two reasons. The first reason was that I was hearing in the media or in the internet almost every day stories of women being killed by their husbands, boyfriends, or exes, and that the generation of so-called love leading to murder echoed my version of the story, where Majnun enjoyed Leyli to die with him. So I kept thinking about it and asking myself, why is Majnun asking her to die? Is it his love or his fear that he expresses? And why would she accept that? And the second reason was more linked to my personal life, because at the time, my mother was severely ill, and we knew that maybe a cure would not be possible. And unfortunately, it turned out to be true, and she passed away during the realization of the book. And this event really changed my vision of the book I was writing, because suddenly the topic was not only love, but it was also grief and mourning, because it's a story of two lovers, and one of them dies, sometimes Majnun, sometimes Leyli, it depends on the versions. And the other has to deal with this loss. So I identified myself a lot with it. And I wondered what I wanted to say about that topic, because the ending I had written previously was saying in a way that after such a tragic loss, life or joy are not possible anymore until you join the person you have lost in death. And that didn't seem right to me. And I was pretty sure that my mother would not have liked this idea at all. So I chose to write an ending that said that we can keep on living after the losses of the ones we love, and that it is not at all being unfaithful to them. On the contrary, keeping on living is a way to keep on carrying this love with us. So that's why I wrote the last chapter, which is Layla's answer to Majnun, and where she explains that to Majnun, and she tells him that for these reasons, she won't join him in death, but she has to live her own life before. And I was quite happy to give the last word of the story to Layla, because in most classical love stories, whether they are Persian or not, I often tend to identify myself more to the female character. And I am often a bit frustrated that the voices of these female characters are not as developed as the ones of the male counterparts. So I was happy to be able to develop the voice of Leyli. So those are the different reasons which led me to conclude the story the way I did. I think that's pretty much all I could say about the process of retelling the story as a French contemporary cartoonist. I am a bit sorry that I spoiled the ending of the comic book if some people here haven't read it and would like to do so. But in a sense, I think that stories like the one of Majnun and Leyli, which have been told and retold so many times, they show us that what is really important is not necessarily what happens in a story, what are the events, but how they are told. So I hope that if you read the comic, you'll still be able to enjoy it, even if you know how it ends. I hope that I haven't been too long or boring, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yann, for this beautiful presentation and, of course, your beautiful book. I would like to open the floor to questions. If people have questions, feel free to ask.
In the beginning, you mentioned cultural touchstone, Eric Clapton, Derek and the Dominoes, Layla and Unsorted love stories. 50 years later in 2022, Tedeschi Trucks Band released I Am the Moon, and you can see it all for free on YouTube well, it's a video album on 4 parts. That corresponds to the physical media of 4 LP disc set. So Susan Tedeschi, Tedeschi, and her husband Derek Trucks. Anyway, they're Southern rock, blues rock grades, and it's like a long video poem, and it incorporates even archival video of pre-revolutionary Iran, and it's like a continuation of Layla and Majnun.
Thank you for mentioning that. Any other questions from the room? Go ahead.
Thank you so much, all of you. It's wonderful. I was just cruising through it while you were talking. My question is to the artist. I want to know what are you got some inspirations? There were some images that came across similar to the trial or temptation of Saint Anthony, especially when Majnun was sleeping and all the animals were surrounding him. Whether you got inspiration from anything else beside the story itself. And correct me if I'm wrong, the color red is really presented in the images, so it's very, very pronounced. What are you had something to say about that also? If you can explain a bit that why color red is beside many meanings that Persian has for color red. Obviously, Nizami in other stories and his half-baked cat, he's playing with colors a lot and meaning of colors. Just wanted to know your take on the colors and whether you have specific things to say about how you chose the colors.
Okay, so to answer about the graphic inspirations of the book, some of them comes, of course, from Iran and Persian miniature. For instance, there are some hints to Behzad images, but you're very right. It was important to me that I drew this book as a European artist, and it was important to have some links between the Oriental and Occidental cultures. Some 4-year-old is coming back to home, so probably it's be. So what did I say? Yeah, so some images are also references to the European art history. There is a picture which is a reference to I don't know how we say that in English. Saint Francis of Saint François d'Assise. So there are some references to European art history as well, because I wanted to have some links between these two histories, these two art histories. And as for the color red, there are several reasons. The first one is that when Majnun goes to the desert, the color of his skin changes and it becomes red. It was yellow, it becomes red, and this is symbolic, like because he's burnt by love, and that's why I changed the color of his skin. And there are also it's like a mix, because sometimes there are purely there are choices that are just graphic because it feels nice to have red with green, or sometimes there are no very elaborate reasons, but sometimes it's symbolic as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Tom, you have a question for Yann?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but
All right.
I'll put only one to Yann, our artist. There's a lot of sort of grotesque, even Gothic grotesque type of developments in the story. Like the second chapter is called "The Song of the Rotting One," the one who's rotting and decomposing, and so you're very much into the physical grotesquerie, if I'm reading it correctly. I wonder whether you might comment on that.
Yeah, why? I didn't want to present I didn't want the book to present this only as like a metaphor, something spiritual. I wanted to show the materiality of death, what is death really, and it's not always beautiful. And to me, it was important to show that death is in a way ugly, and what a corpse looks like, how it rots, because I think that it makes the beauty of love even more beautiful, to contrast with this presence of death and this materiality of death.
Great, excellent answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful, thank you. Professor Jilkowski, you have a question? Jill, would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to read it? You just unmute yourself.
She's unable, she says, to unmute herself.
Oh, there we go. Okay, first it was saying I couldn't. Thank you. What amazing presentations and what a beautiful book. I can't wait to get a copy of it. So I was just noticing also in those remarkable images some hints of Hildegard of Bingen's visionary experiences where she also has like the page is full of beautiful stars, all in different configurations and colors. Anyway, maybe another reference point of yours. But as long as I am here with the speaker on, or the mic on, I'm wondering what you're working on next, Yann, or right now, if you have any comparable projects going on. Thank you.
I love Hildegard de Bingen. I didn't think it was, I was aware that I had an inspiration, but since I love this image, that's pretty possible that it came out in my book. And I'm working on a project currently. It's also linked to Iran, but it's very different because it's more about contemporary Iran. It's a book I'm working on with one of my friends, and he was born in Iran, but his parents are from Afghanistan. And it's the story of the Afghan people who live in Iran, and how is their daily life, and how they struggle, how that kind of things. So based on this story.
Thank you. Look forward to that one too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Yann.
I have a question for Yann. I mentioned my favorite record this decade so far, Tedeschi Trucks band, I Am the Moon. My favorite French record ever, Serge Gainsbourg comic strip. I wonder if that could be turned into a graphic novel. That would be interesting to turn the album into the music into a graphic novel.
I didn't hear well with the sound. Maybe if you could repeat the question because I can hear your voice better.
If someone could turn Serge Gainsbourg's comic strip, or is it comic book? Anyway, it's a classic record by Serge Gainsbourg. Reconceptualize it as a graphic novel. The songs from Serge Gainsbourg's comic book.
Yann, do you know the comic he's talking about?
But I didn't read it, but I saw it, but I didn't read it. So
That's a good idea. Okay, I believe.
J'ai une petite question. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say a few words in French because we are with Yann Damizen qui nous a fait le plaisir d'être là et je voulais vraiment le remercier aussi pour ses propos très, très intelligents et sensibles et un livre qui est magnifique. And so I wanted to thank Bilal, the publisher, because we met several occasions. And I'm from the French consulate, I'm the cultural attaché. And so Bilal told us about the project and we are very excited. And we hope to support him for other books in the future. And thank you for the department at UFT to have this wonderful event. And well, I'm very proud of this French artist. He did a great job.
And thank you for co-sponsoring our event for today. And we look forward to collaborating with you more.
Yeah.
I guess we're running. Question, didn't you? I guess we're running. Nargis, did you have a question?
I don't see her.
Right there.
Oh.
No,
Nargis,
I don't, Mohammed. I am just thankful and fascinated that I was introduced to this work by three amazing people who made such a presentation. And Yann, I am such a fan now. I already ordered the book as I was listening to you. It's fantastic. I love the sensitivity that you put into it, your creativity, your artistic imagination just takes it to such a different level. So I can't, thank you enough, and to the translators for bringing this work. Thank you so much.
An exemplary collaboration between three people, really outstanding.
That is exemplary, that the academic and the artistic worlds have come together in such a beautiful manner. And that is what I wrote up there saying, I find this really fascinating. So thanks to all three of you, Thomas and Aqsa and Yann, for this work.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Navgul. Please go ahead and buy your book. The book is available on Amazon, and I think it's a mind-blowing experience for all of us. I have translated the book, I have read the book, and I still can't get enough of it. So thank you so much. I guess this is a good note to end. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for coming here in person, and take care.
Have a nice day.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Yann.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.